Now, Unit 6 really has 3 integrated topics in it. We're going to talk about communications, and we're going to talk about conflict within organizations, and we're going to talk about how that conflict is often resolved through negotiation. So the 3 are related because this is something that is common in organizations. What you need to be able to do, whether you're a member of a team, member of a group, working with other people, it's important that we be able to express our concerns, views, thoughts in such a way that it is interpreted positively by other people and doesn't get people's backs up or causes people to be not in the know or to hide information. So the idea is that we want to be able to use good communication skills to ensure that we minimize the conflict in organizations. And a lot of the conflict that comes from organizations largely falls on the fact that communications is poor. So if we have good communications, it reduces the opportunity for conflict. It never eliminates it, but it certainly reduces it. So we're doing a lot of things in this unit in terms of key issues, okay? We're going to define communications and why communications is important. Particularly one type of communications called the formal communications. And formal communications is the organizational chain of command and how information should be relayed in an organization. Obviously, we're talking about some of the challenges, so we're going to discuss some of the barriers to effective communication. We're going to explain how informal communications in organizations, something called the grapevine, and we're going to look at that and how that either contributes or takes away from effective communications. We're going to discuss gender differences, and this is a very interesting one because the fact of the matter is the different genders have different views on how things should be communicated, and oftentimes the approach that one gender will use is not necessarily the one that another would use, and probably not the most effective. We're going to discuss the challenges related to cultural communication problems, and when we're dealing across cultures or people from different cultures, we'll understand or appreciate things differently. We're going to look finally in the communications part about computer-mediated communications. And we're dealing with a classic example right here, right now. And how does that impact communications? What's the good? What's the bad? What's the ugly in terms of that? And finally, in terms of wrapping it all up, to review personal strategies and initiatives aimed at enhancing communications. So that's really that first part of the chapter, and that constitutes about 2/3 of the topic. As we move into conflict and negotiation, we're going to define interpersonal conflict and review the causes of it. We're going to explain the different types of conflict and the various modes of managing conflict. Obviously, that is the critical thing. Conflict exists. The question is, what do we do about it? So number 11 is certainly the one that is most critical. And part and parcel of managing conflict is negotiation, so a range of negotiation techniques. And sometimes, that last one, discuss the merits of stimulating conflict. Sometimes organizations purposely create conflict, manage conflict in such a way that it is positive as opposed to negative. No different than what we'd have when we have competition, for example, is really a form of managed conflict. Okay, so what are we looking at in this unit? Well, you're looking at Chapter 6 of the textbook, but you're also looking at Unit 6 of the course, and there's a whole bunch of things in there that you can look at. And effectively, these slides are a summary of those things that you can look at there in Unit 6 and a summary of the material that is covered in the chapter. It's just easier to put it in one place. So looking at Part 1, communications. The very, very first thing that we really have to understand is what is communications. It seems kind of simplistic, but the fact of the matter is that we do really need to define what communications mean. So communication is formally, it's a process by which information is exchanged. Okay, so it's simply that, is how is information exchanged? And you could imagine that the exchange could take place over different platforms or different ways. And that exchange is always really between what's called a sender, someone who sends out the information, and someone who gets the information called a receiver. So the sender and receiver are critical for communications to work, because otherwise you're either, if you're a sender and there's no one listening, you're just speaking into an echo chamber. And if you're a receiver and there's no one sending you information, you're not going to hear anything or see anything. So the sender encodes his or her thoughts into some form that can be transmitted to the receiver. So this encoding process creates some challenges, because the very fact that we can't communicate directly, we have to go through some form of channel in order to communicate. And how we put that into channel and how someone takes it out of the channel is going to impact how it's interpreted. So the sender encodes his or her thoughts into some form and is transmitted to the receiver. And when we think about transmit it, we could transmit it electronically, transmit it in writing, transmit it in verbal, transmit it in any form of way that it could be transmitted. The receiver must perceive the message and accurately decode it in order to achieve understanding. There we run into problems, because the perception of the message is sometimes wrong, and the accurate decoding of the message is sometimes wrong. You can imagine it like static on the other end of the static on the phone line or on the computer line. You didn't really understand what was said because of the static. The receiver tells the sender that the message has been received and understood through feedback. So feedback is an important loop. Speaking of feedback, important loop, just to kind of illustrate this communication process here, I've got this little graphic, and this little graphic is kind of the standard graphic that explains communication between people and organizations, internally, externally, how information is sent and decoded and received. On the far left, where's my little duplicate? Right here. Okay. On the far left here, we have the sender. So this is the typical kind of, simplified version of how information is relayed. So the sender sends information, and in order to send that information, it's encoded. So what do we mean by encode it? Types it in their cell phone into a text message, types it into an email, types it onto a piece of paper, speaks into a telephone receiver, speaks into a computer microphone. Those are all forms of encoding. If you look at the microphone in front of you now, that microphone takes the sound, and the vibrations from the sound causes that to turn into an electrical signal. Basically, in your microphone, there's a little piece of plastic that is vibrating back and forth. That is hooked to a little magnet, and that magnet is jumping up and down over a wire, and that wire then is creating an electrical current, which is being sent off through the system. So that's encoding. Now, there's all kinds of problems with encoding, because maybe the microphone is not very good. Maybe, that the sound is muffled. Maybe you can't hear it. Maybe it's a different language. Maybe the way it's said. All of those things can cause the encoding process to get kind of out of shape. Once it's encoded, then it goes through some sort of what we call a channel. And that channel could be any, a letter through the postal system. This we're dealing with here, once it goes out of the microphone, it goes into the magic box called the computer, and it gets sent over the internet and out into your speakers. So that's what we call the channel. Channels can be long, channels can be short. It really doesn't matter. The fact is that it goes through some sort of channel. Once it goes on the other end of the channel, it comes out on your speaker, for example, it gets decoded. So your speaker is the exact same thing, only in reverse. It is the electrical signal goes in, it magnetizes a wire, and there's a piece of iron inside of that spool of copper. That iron is made to go back and forth. It kind of makes it vibrate, and the vibrations go in get caught into a little piece of plastic or a piece of paper called a speaker cone, and that in turn causes the ear to move, which is the sound of my voice coming out of the speakers. So that's the decoding system. Again, there's all kinds of problems that could potentially happen there. Maybe the speaker's not very good. Maybe the sound is not high enough. You know, these sorts of things in terms of decoding. And then it is received by the receiver. So it goes through this process of encoding and decoding through a channel. So there's all kinds of opportunities for the message to get distorted somewhere along the way. The receiver, on the other hand, is going to receive that message in light of a bunch of things. And those two circles that we have there, the sender's field of experience and the receiver's field of experience, those circles relate to how the receiver receives the information. And let's say, for example, I grew up in Buttons, okay? I'm going to tell you that I walked up Main Street in Buttons to the Dickhead lots and lots of times, okay? Now, if you've never been in Buttons, or if you don't know anything about mining, you have no idea what a dickhead is. Now, if I spoke to anyone who was from Buttons, who grew up in Buttons, they would know exactly what I was talking about, okay? Because they've probably done it themselves. They can relate to it. They can visualize it. They can see it. They can. And there's the dickhead, which is that's where the mine shaft came up, right? And this big structure is at the top of what we call Main Street. So this picture is taken on Main Street. So walking up this road, you're looking at that structure. Now, anyone and everyone from Bucklands can relate to that. People who are not familiar with it cannot relate to it. Your field of experience is not the same as mine. So the information that I just said to you is garbage to you. It doesn't make any sense, right? It is irrelevant to you. So this is one of the big problems that occur in communications. If you can't relate to what the person is telling you, it's very difficult for you to understand what they mean. So sometimes, and you run into this, you probably run into it yourself, where you start telling someone something, but they don't have a clue what you're talking about. It happens to me all the time. I think it's called marriage. But if they don't understand what you're talking about because you have failed to enlighten them with the field of experience. They, you know, if I told my wife about an experience I had yesterday, assuming that she was there with me and she wasn't, she's going to look at me like I got two heads, right? Because the field of experience is not the same. And this is a big problem in the communications world in business. Do managers understand that their workers appreciate all of the nuances of what is being discussed? Oh, you know, we had meetings and, you know, the managers had a meeting, the managers are talking about it. Well, it's great, but the staff weren't at the meeting. They can't relate to what occurred in the meeting, right? So as you talk about it, a lot of people are going to say, I don't know what you're talking about. Or I don't, or even worse, they say, I interpret it so much differently than you do. And whenever we have misinterpretations, this is when information goes awry. So the decoding process and the encoding process may have happened correctly, but because of the different fields of experiences, the understanding of what was meant from the decoding process is wrong. And people misinterpret what was being said. And it happens all the time. So one of the things you have to concern yourself with in communications, always in communications, is does the person I'm communicating with share the same field of experience that I do? And if they don't, it's like me telling you, oh, walk up to Main Street, walk up top of Main Street, and we're looking at the dickhead. If you don't have a clue what the dickhead is, that means nothing to you. And if you don't have a clue what the person on the other end is telling you, because you don't have a good understanding of the background, you're not going to understand what was said. Another important point that comes out of this is if the field of experiences are different, the receiver has to have the opportunity to respond, to give some feedback, to say, I don't know what you're talking about. Could you please show me a picture of the dickhead so I have an idea of what you're talking about? These sorts of things allow a person to question and to get a better understanding of the overall issue that's being communicated. Now, in amongst all of this, we have this thing called noise. Because as I told you about the dickhead, you're thinking about, well, your kids are home from school and they're doing something outside the room now. It sounds like they're into the kitchen cupboards taking the pots out. Or there was a loud bang and you're not sure what happened. So effectively, you became distracted during the communication episode. So the encoding, the channel, the decoding, you became distracted somehow. And that distraction is called noise. It doesn't literally need to be noise. A couple of examples I gave, the pots and pans or whatever, they're noise. But it could be you're off in a daydream. You're thinking about something else. Your mind is just not present in the discussion. This is all referred to as noise, and noise interrupts or eliminates oftentimes the communication process because I simply am not listening to you. I don't know what you just said, huh? That sort of thing. This is what happens when we get noise. So the takeaway is that because the communication system is so complex, this whole process is so complex with so many moving parts, of encoding, a channel, decoding, noise, an opportunity for response, the different fields of experiences. Because of all these things, this explains why communications is often poor or not effective. So, considering that communications can be problematic in an organization, we need to consider, well, what are some of the types of conversations or communications that we have in conversation that can either help expedite this communication process to make it work well or work against it, okay? So a lot of thought has been given into and a lot of research has been done with regards to communications in the workplace. And effectively, communications in the workplace is broken down into two basic types. There's something called formal communications. And formal communications are communications that come from the organization that follow an established information route. So, for example, you have an organization that has a boss and 3 employees. Okay, well, the formal communications is every week the boss has a meeting. On Monday mornings, we have a meeting just to discuss what's going on. Okay, that's a form of formal communications. It's established by the organization. It's standard. Everybody shows up at the meeting. Everybody is designed to be able to get the information on what's going on. That's a formal process that is written out or as part of the culture of the organization on how communication is delivered. We could also think about email within the office, memos, bulletin boards, you name it. These are all what we would consider to be formal, established communication paths that are used in order to communicate effectively with the organization. Formal organizational communication is great, provided it follows a set of rules that everybody understands, okay? For example, we always have a meeting on Monday morning, okay? So everybody has to understand that, and that is the path on which the information is provided. However, most organizations have another channel of communications called the informal communications. We are super familiar with informal communications. It's gossip, it's the lunchroom, it's water cooler talk, it's whatever you want to call it. It's not set up by the organization. It's set up by the informal groups in the organization. They have a chat, they're chatting over, or they're talking about, or they're sending emails back to one another about, it's not a formal part of the organization. It is informal. So, we tend to have this type of system where office gossip or office communication emerges, and that can create some problems. So a great deal of information travels quickly through organizations through this informal channel. And because so much has been, because so much stock has been put into this, we call this the grapevine. I heard it through the grapevine, Marvin Gaye, or Creedence Clearwater Revival. The grapevine is the informal communications network in an organization. Cuts across formal lines, it's not based on an organizational design, it's based on people knowing one another design. It's often thought about word of mouth, but it could be written notes, email, fax messages. We don't see very many faxes anymore. Organizations may have several loosely coordinated grapevine systems, and a grapevine may transmit information that is relevant to the performance of the organization as well as personal gossip. So it can be factual or it could be non-factual. And that is the problem with the grapevine, is that because it could be right or it could be wrong, it leads to problems, because whenever it's wrong, that creates concern. Oh, I heard that there was layoffs coming. Do you? That sort of thing. So this informal process can lead to some problems. So what does it say to organizations? Get rid of the informal process? It's very hard to remove the grapevine effect in organizations. What it does say to organizations is organizations need to be very careful and very aware that they need to get out ahead with formal communication. So if there is some information to be relayed, it should be relayed as opposed to holding it, because whenever people are unaware of what the truth is, then lies and innuendo and gossip is going to be fostered by that. Okay, so now that we know that there's two types of communication, organizations need to be very good with their formal communications in order to make it work, to reduce the chances of informal communications kind of undermining things. We've got to think, well, what are some of the big barriers to communications, either formal or informal? It doesn't really matter, but it's certainly jobs up. If we were to think about that communications path that we just looked at, where we have the sender, an encoding through a channel, a decoding to the receiver, several things can block that channel. The first thing that blocks that channel is something called filtering. Filtering is pretty common. And filtering is a tendency for a message to be watered down or stopped altogether. Filtering can be useful to ensure that the right information is available, but overzealous filtering can preclude the right people from getting the right information. So effectively, filtering says, I'm going to tell you, but I'm not going to tell you everything. Or I'm only going to tell you the good news, not the bad news. Or I'm going to leave out some critical parts that I think would cause me problems or could be embarrassing, or these sorts of things. So filtering is common in organizations because the fact is that we as humans will try to put the best message on things. We're at the same time guarding our own selves. So we're not going to put out anything that reflects negatively on ourselves. So if you think about managers, if the organization, for example, is falling apart, nobody's going to talk about that. If you think about this election, for example, this never-ending election that we're in, we could argue that filtering is hugely a big problem in this organization that we call Newfoundland and Labrador, because the election did not discuss the elephant in the room. The elephant in the room is the huge debt that we're facing, but we very rarely, if ever, saw the politicians talking about that issue. It was always something a little more rosy, like we're promising you XYZ project, or we're promising you XYZ dollars. It was never, how are we going to pay our bills? That nobody wanted to talk about that. Nobody wanted to hear it. And as a result, we could argue that the election, from a communications point of view, failed miserably because of the huge amount of filtering that was on the go. Another big barrier to effective communication is something called selective perception. Now, selective perception, unlike filtering really occurs when the sender manages the message and what's sent. Selective perception, on the other hand, is more so from the point of view of the receiver. There, the receiver is only listening to the bits that the receiver wants to hear. So it is a form of filtering on the part of the receiver. I only want to hear certain things. So selective perception refers to filtering what we see and hear to suit our own needs. This process is often done unconsciously, which is a concern, right? We don't even have to think about it. We're just looking for stuff that we want to hear. Take, for example, if someone speaks and they're talking, oh man, they don't shut up. They're still talking, but they mention your name. Suddenly it grabs your attention. Okay? This is our selective perception. We do not hear, we're filtering things out because we don't want to hear, we're distracted, noise is creeping in, whatever. And then suddenly your name comes into the conversation, voila, you pay instant attention. So over time, we're going to make assumptions about the way things are and the basis of our past experience. And often much of the process is unconscious. Selective perception is a time saver, a necessary tool for a complex culture, but it can lead to mistakes. And the reason it can lead to mistakes is we kind of the taken for grantedness. We assume certain things are a certain way, and we assume that certain information we already know, and as a result, we glaze over the things that we thought that we already knew, and we miss something. This is a real problem. So, for example, because of selective perception, we've had a lot of accidents happen out there in the world. If you think about the airline business, for example, when a pilot or a captain on an airplane is flying the plane, that person has 30,000 hours of experience flying, can fly it with their eyes closed. This leads to what's called selective perception because they are so experienced that they take a lot of things for granted. And they may not notice things that are out of the ordinary. And because of this lack of notice, things can get missed and accidents can happen. So in order to combat this, what airlines have done, for example, is they have what's called checklists. So a crew in a situation has to go through a certain checklist. So if the motor dies on the plane, here's the checklist for what we need to do. So these types of checklists are designed to ensure that things aren't missed. One of the big barriers to communication that, I forgot an N in communication. One of the big barriers to communication that we often see is this problem of defensiveness. And this is the proverbial getting your back up against the wall. Defensiveness is a primary barrier to effective communication because when a person is being defensive, they actually don't really listen to the other person. Okay, so again, defensiveness is mainly from the perspective of the receiver. And let's say, for example, you're a receiver and someone's telling you something that you don't want to hear. You did a very poor job in this project and you're being reprimanded. Okay, let's say that that's a terrible situation and you're into it and you're thinking to yourself, here I am, and someone's pointing their fingers at me and telling me that I did wrong. Oh, I feel awful. The moment you feel awful, the opportunity for us in our brains to be defensive kicks in. It's a natural human trait. And generally, we have what's called the fight or flight behavior instilled in us. It's genetically hardwired into all humans where we either take one of two perspectives. We either argue against it, fight, or flight, we walk away from it, or we get away from the problem as far as we can. Ignore it. Okay? So, if we think about fight, yelling, arguing, and aggressive behavior are typical of that, we know when we're trying to have a conversation that is not an effective way to pursue a conversation. Flight, running away physically or emotionally. We know that that doesn't help resolve the situation. Now, they have two more built into here, and these are all forms of fight and flight. And that is freeze, look like a deer in the headlights. And effectively, that is as much the flight where we're just physically or psychologically, emotionally disconnecting ourselves. Or faint, which is, again, a form of flight too, where we just basically falls asleep. we just, our consciousness is just overwhelmed, our brain is overwhelmed, and we just shut down. So we're into a situation here when people get defensive, that they either have their back up against the wall and they fight and they don't want to hear anything, and that communication system falls apart, or they ignore it in some way or another, either by running away, physically running away, or emotionally running away, freezing up, or just fainting. Neither one of those are effective for resolving the communications difficulties. In terms of defensive behaviors, defensive behaviors show up when a person doesn't feel physically or emotionally safe. Usually there is a perceived or real threat. When acted on, defensive behaviors are barriers to effective communications. Now, we've seen that in some of the examples we've seen so far, that a lot of the organizations that are trying to deal with this problem are using something called non-judgmental decision making, okay? And we've seen in some of the examples that organizations to do that, Toyota, for example. Well, anyone can shut down the assembly line. Well, the idea is that instead of people worrying about having to defend their actions, let's just not judge them. Let's just not, and that way people won't have to defend it. And if people feel legitimately that they should shut down the assembly line in order to get some problem fixed, they can shut it down. So this eliminates, or it should eliminate, the defensive behaviors. That's the theory behind it, is that we wouldn't have these defensive behaviors if people don't have to justify themselves. Another big barrier to effective organizational communication is emotions. All emotions are normal. This is typical of humans, right? That said, it's important to have an appropriate way to manage our emotional expressions, as inappropriate emotional expressions can wreak havoc and cause significant damage to communications. These are the sorts of things that are dead giveaways that we don't have something going right with regards to our communications in our organizations. The biggest one that I find in terms of organizational communications, information overload. It's just so much coming at you, man. There's no way to even interpret it all. And information overload is just an occurring when information processing demands on the individual's time to perform interactions and internal calculations exceed the capacity to do it. You're just so overwhelmed. So if we think about a communications process when we have 6 people talking to us at once, there's an example of information overload, right? There's no way we can understand what 6 people are saying. So messages reach us, but we're not understanding them. There's just too much coming at us at once. So we need to find a way to be able to manage the information overload somehow. Another big barrier to communications is language. Oh man, if you ever go to work for provincial government, you'll learn all about language. And language, well, if we all speak English, great, that's one thing. But what we're really talking about is the language of the workplace as opposed to the language of the workplace. So for example, and I often find it in the college, it goes on too, that students like you come in, and new people like me come in, even though I'm 30 years new, but new people come into the organization, and we hear terms beat around in the college that are commonplace. So for example, if I mention the word peers to you, what does it mean? P-I-R-S. Do you have any idea?
P-I-R-S?
Yeah, peers.
No. I always think peers, like your co-workers, but
no, P-I-R-S. Yeah. the college has this database of information that you have in your course here. It's a database that basically says the material that will be covered in each course. So every course has a PIRS, Program Information Retrieval Service is what it stands for. It's an acronym. And if you go look in your course, and right here, Winter 21 course information, down here, I got this, look, PS 2340 official PIRS outline. Now, nobody's ever questioned it before. What in the heck is that? What is PIRS? But what you'll see with PIRS right here, PIRS is the college's official descriptor of what happens in a course, okay? What you guys will cover in a course. So, for example, here we are. This is the stuff that we're doing. This comes right into college, so basically it tells me what I need to cover for a course, and it tells you what's going to be covered in the course. And the idea is it breeds consistency. So we often beat around, internal speak in the college beats around this term PIRS. And I even made the mistake here by putting the word PIRS in it. I put it in not for you, but for me as much as anything, the word PIRS, because it doesn't mean anything to you. So it is what we call jargon. And workplace jargon is a common problem in all workplaces. Workplaces have a language in and of their own. So the college has PIRS. The college has umpteen names on stuff that has been labeled within the college, and we talk about it internal speak as if everybody knows what it is. The various departments of government, the same thing. They have internal speak that people inside the organization are probably familiar with. If they're new to the organization, they're probably not familiar with, but they got to figure it out by themselves. So jargon is a real impediment to communications, because what it does is it assumes that people know the meaning of things when they really don't. So it's the specialized language used by the job holders or members of the particular occupations or organization. Jargon can be an efficient means of communicating. Instead of saying program information review system, retrieval system, I say PIRS. It's simpler, isn't it? From my perspective, but it means nothing to you. And so can also serve as a barrier to communicating with others, especially those outside or the organization or another profession. And every organization has jargon. And organizations need to be aware that their jargon exists. And you can become blind to it because you are in the organization and you naturally assume that everybody knows it. Another big barrier to effective communication is nonverbal language of work. And nonverbal language is as much, about 50, maybe more than 50% of communication is nonverbal, your facial expressions, whatever. That often gets lost. So for example, it would get lost in this environment we're in here. It gets lost when people can't see one another. It gets lost, any number of ways. So what we need to worry about in nonverbal communications is how do we relay that information, and should we be relaying that information? If I'm yawning, for example, it's certainly my body language is that this is not all that interesting.